Welcome to Tough Talk. I'm your host, Paul Taros, and today my guest is Dennis Marburger. Dennis is a longtime Bloomfield resident, a Republican precinct delegate. He has been a delegate to the last two Republican national conventions. He serves on the Michigan GOP State Committee. He serves on the 9th Congressional District Executive Committee, is an Oakland County coordinator for Campaign for Liberty, board member of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Michigan, head of the Michigan chapter of PANDA, president of the Birmingham Bloomfield Republican Club, and a volunteer with the Michigan 10th Amendment Center. He has been a frequent guest on this show and is a champion in the fight for liberty. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Paul. It's an honor to be here once again on Tough Talk with Taros, the #1 political TV talk show in Oakland County and, in fact, in the whole state of Michigan.
Well, that's very nice of you to say. Today, I think we're going to have a little controversial topic, talking about the Pledge of Allegiance. And so to start with the Pledge of Allegiance, who was Francis Bellamy?
Well, that's very good. And Paul, let me just preface my remarks by saying, of course, I'm giving only my viewpoint, not for any of those organizations. You were kind enough to reference some of the activities I'm involved in some of those groups. So these are my views. I'm not speaking for them. But Francis Bellamy was a Baptist minister in the late 19th century. He was actually a socialist. He had a radical doctrine that he preached from his church. He was eventually thrown out of the church. They thought he was not Christ-centric, but rather politically motivated and motivated in terms of promoting socialism and that sort of thing, what he called sort of a Christian socialism. And he was the cousin of a fellow named Edward Bellamy. And Edward Bellamy had written a book entitled 1887 to 2000, Looking Backward, in which the main character, a fellow named Julian West, had fallen asleep, sort of Rip Van Winkle-like, in 1887, and then in the year 2000 woke up and was in this, frankly, a Soviet-style communistic utopian paradise society where everything was state-owned, owned by the government, and people would retire at 45. They had guaranteed jobs and that sort of thing. And what Edward Bellamy, this book, as it turns out, I mean, it sounds very strange, but it was an extremely popular book. Apparently, it was the second most popular novel of the 19th century in America, the most popular being Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there were these groups around called these nationalist groups. They were really promoting a form of socialism, really a form of national socialism, actually. And that's what Edward Bellamy was doing, and Francis Bellamy had various ways in which he tried to promote that.
Okay. And just so everybody knows, Francis Bellamy was the person who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance.
Well, that was going to be if you asked me how that tied in. Yes, Francis Bellamy is the author of the Pledge of Allegiance. And he also came up with something later called the Bellamy Salute.
Okay. And what was the Bellamy Salute?
Well, the Bellamy Salute was the stiff-armed salute with the palm down that we would typically associate with the Nazis or the Italian fascists. But that was actually something that Francis Bellamy came up with. His idea was that when the pledge would be recited, including by young school children, that they would stand there in front of the flag, giving that stiff-armed salute. And so they did this. Occurred for decades. Benito Mussolini saw it. He liked it, and he adopted it for the Italian fascists. Hitler saw it and adopted it for the Nazis. In America, the thought was during World War II, well, that wouldn't be very good to be doing what they're doing. So they said, well, we'll do palms up instead of palms down, and that'll make all the difference. And later it was he said, just put the hand over the heart and that sort of thing. But it is interesting that the Bellamy Salute inspired Mussolini and Hitler to adopt that for their purposes.
Okay. Now, they officially changed it to the hand over the heart. Was that in like the
I think it was in the
1940?
50s, maybe in the early 50s.
Okay.
I think they started doing that, but they had gone from the palm down to the palm up. But I think I remember though hearing about that when I was very young in public school when we did maybe the teachers had told us how they used to do that, the Bellamy salute. I don't know if they called it that, but there certainly was and I think still is a point where starting the school day or before scout meetings, before political activities, people get together and they recite the pledge, which is written by the socialist Francis Bellamy.
Okay. Now, why did Francis Bellamy write the Pledge of Allegiance?
Well, Paul, there were a couple of reasons. I mean, one is he was looking to do things to promote the ideas expressed by his cousin Edward Bellamy, but also directly, he was approached by a flag company that was literally looking to promote flag sales. And so he wrote this pledge where he started out, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic." And so interestingly, so the idea was to generate this, and he was paid money for it. And it first appeared, I think it was Vanity Fair magazine, but it was on the 400th anniversary, in 1892, was supposed to mark 400 years of Columbus and his voyage. We say Columbus discovering America or Cuba or that sort of thing. And so that's how they tied that in 1892. And the timing there, of course, is very interesting, because when you read the words of the pledge, which did not include the phrase "under God" when he wrote it, and this man was supposed to be a Baptist minister, right? Okay, but it did mention in one nation, indivisible. One of the things that Francis Bellamy was trying to do, one of the things that his cousin Edward Bellamy was trying to do, was to eradicate the founding philosophy, the founding political doctrines of America in order to help accomplish this Soviet style, they don't think they used that word, but this National Socialist system in one giant consolidated nation. And by having it recited by school children, for instance, they thought they could utilize that to have children indoctrinated, and everybody just assumed that that's the way things were. It is a direct contradiction of what's written in the Declaration of Independence, in what's written in the Lee Resolution, which was approved 2 days before the Declaration was approved, which says that these 13 colonies are and of right ought to be 13 free and independent states. When you examine the events that took place in American political philosophy up until the 1860s, there was no dispute about the point, really, that the states had come together voluntarily, first each individually, not on July 4th, but each individually seceding from, leaving the British Empire. Then in the Second Continental Congress, coming together and forming a confederation under the Articles. Then leaving the Articles and coming together and forming a federal union, a constitutional federal union, and they said it was a voluntary type of a thing. And that the states, and the Constitution was actually ratified on the basis and on the condition that a state could leave, or a group of states could leave peacefully, and they wouldn't be attacked by the others. And that was later affirmed by Thomas Jefferson. But through the 3 states, Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York, all said that. Bellamy was trying to help wipe that idea out. In 1892, it was still a matter of some controversy, of course, because it wasn't that long after the War of the 1860s. But the pledge became wildly popular, and part of the reason for that was through all the indoctrination that went on. In fact, Bellamy was a member of the National Education Association. He was on the committee for programs, and they made this a big deal throughout the schools. And they had various things that were done in their campaign, denigrating private schools, denigrating parochial schools, promoting government-run, what they called public schools, which of course are quite prominent today, and seeing that as a method by which they could get this new ideology in. It is ironic as you think about it, Paul. This was really a big part of what we call the progressive era. And today, of course, there's controversy because when you bring these things up, sometimes people get offended. But these are oftentimes it's people who don't like progressivism, or they would say, or so they typically say. And yet, this was a big part of it. This was really a very, very important event.
So the NEA promoted the reciting of the pledge, and wasn't that tied in with schools purchasing flags?
Yes, well, that's so very good. Yeah, so this is part of the flag sales end of it. So the guy that was selling flags, that worked out great for him. So he got what he was looking for out of it. A lot of flags were purchased, and in addition, you had this program that was done, which was really inculcating the minds of American youth in ways that are totally opposed to the founding thoughts and the founding political doctrines, and not just founding, but also because previous to the founding of the Constitutional Federal Republic, or Constitutional Federal Union rather, independence from Great Britain, from the British Empire, was achieved through each of these 13 states individually leaving the British Empire, and then each individually signing the peace treaty, and all of this whole idea of a voluntary union of political societies of states that had all the rights of all other states, including of Great Britain and France, as the Lee Resolution stated, just totally wiping that out. And they were pretty successful at it, as you think about it, because now the idea of what Jefferson and Madison and Patrick Henry and Sam Adams and all those guys in the Second Continental Congress were talking about, and the signers of the Declaration of Independence, those ideas are unfortunately now in the minority, and people are usually on the defensive regarding them, because we have this giant nation state which is at variance with what the Americans of the 1770s and subsequent decades thought and expressed and established.
So the word of indivisible in the pledge would be troubling to anybody who supports states' rights.
Supports states' rights, or supports federalism, or the idea that states retained the authority and the responsibility to protect the rights of the people within those states. So it is very troubling. And it should also be very troubling to anybody that studies world history when you consider the record of what happens with very large nation states and personal freedom and safety inside those, as compared to what happens in a more federative system as we had, where the power is more diffused, it's local, and there's less of it in the political system. When you look at these giant empires, for the most part, they tend to be negative for human rights and things of that nature. Now, in America, to be fair, there's a historian named Anthony Gregory who I was reading, he's pointing this out. Often there was an emancipatory aspect to it, so it wasn't as bad. But the problem is, if you centralize everything, you run the risk of having a society where, through the auspices of political activity, through a relatively narrow group of people of special interests, they are able to essentially dictate to everybody else. And we're seeing that. What's happened is things have become more centralized in Washington, D.C. Our freedom, our privacy, those things have all been under attack. And it's really a very critical matter that decentralization, it was a building block for America. It was something that made America exceptional and different from other countries. As Tom Wood says in a video where he talks about this sort of thing, the idea that we would pledge allegiance to a vast nation state, a singular state, is not American. It's European. It's French. And he even quoted a French political philosopher who said that in France, well, the states, they're like subsidiaries, but France is, this one nation state. Otto von Bismarck said the same thing, for Germany, when he took all those German states and put them together in one Reich. And we know what eventually happened after a long period of time. It was a very bad thing. The Soviet Union, what happened there? You look at China, Red China, and that sort of thing. You look at the Ottoman Empire, another horrible example of that. We could say that looking at the British Empire and the United States and all of its possessions, the record is somewhat more mixed. But I think for Americans here at home, if we really study what's happened over a long period of time, for the ordinary, average person, the amount of freedom has been declining, the amount of laws and statutes that are imposed on us in ways that are contrary even to the Constitution, to which the office holders and the bureaucrats and the enforcers take an oath. The statute books have exploded, and we're even at a point now where there are some who say the average person in this country, particularly if they use the computer or go on the internet, probably commits 3 felonies a day, not because they have a guilty intent, but just with nobody knows what all these things are, and we're under a 24/7 surveillance state. The government has now said under the NDAA, sections 1021 and 1022, that the president can declare somebody a terrorist and put them away, disappear them. And Lindsey Graham, U.S. Senator, gets up on the floor of the Senate and says, shut up, you don't get a lawyer. All of these things are growing out of this centralization, consolidated. Really, it's an insurrection. It's an insurrection against the constitutional system that was set up, which in itself, if you study the history of it, was kind of an interesting situation in that it was a little bit of a coup. It was a coup d'etat against the Confederation that had come before that with the Articles. We don't have time to get into all the details, but it is a fascinating history. But you're absolutely right. And there's another aspect too, Paul, and I'd like to mention just the whole idea of pledging allegiance. What that word allegiance means is that you have a liege or a lord. And there have been over times, it's less common now than it was previously, but people are starting to bring this back up. For those who are believers, people of faith, who read the Bible, and this was, as I say, was more prevalent in previous decades. Can you serve 2 masters? They say, well, gee, in the Bible, Jesus, don't give an oath. And people are pledging allegiance, saying that their Lord is this nation state. And again, this is ironic because it was written by a Baptist minister. But there are people who say you have to look into that and say, is that really what I want to do? Do I pledge my allegiance here, or to a set of principles, or to the Almighty? But there are those who make some pretty cogent arguments that the pledge of allegiance, by giving allegiance to a government of this type, is actually something at variance with Christian doctrine.
Okay. To change the topic a little bit, still talking about the pledge.
Okay.
Originally, Francis Bellamy wrote, I pledge allegiance to my flag.
Right.
And it didn't mention of the United States of America. And it was changed, and, to my flag or to the flag of the United States of America, because they were concerned a number of immigrants were pledging allegiance to their flag of their homeland. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I think there was that's interesting. There was earlier in the 19th century a large wave of immigrants that were coming from these countries where either in Italy or in Germany or in other countries centralization was going on, and they wanted to get away from the German ones in particular, get away from a more Prussian type of a situation, didn't want to be involved in wars and that sort of thing, and then they got thrown into that. Yeah, I think that was part of it, to promote this idea, to maybe either eradicate or tamp down any ideas of community based on the old country. But also, I think the other point, Paul, is that they were really promoting this idea to people who had already been here, trying to meld both the newcomers and those who had been here, their families for generations, into one single unitary body that through politics, that people who wanted to put others to service for their own agenda could accomplish. And so that is an interesting thing that you noted there.
Okay. So when the pledge was first released, how did it affirm or contradict traditional American political doctrine at that time?
Well, that's a great question, Paul. As I mentioned earlier, by talking about one nation indivisible, it frankly is an inaccurate. It's a lie. America was not one nation indivisible. It was, the nation state idea, in other words. I mean, you could say that, well, there's one country where Americans, just like in other countries, like in Germany, they had at one time all the different German states. They were all Germans, but it wasn't an indivisible nation state, an indivisible political jurisdiction. So the pledge was, and I think you could say it's a repudiation of the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration says, as did the Lee Resolution, and this was American political thought, was that yes, political jurisdictions and tax subdivisions, they are divisible. If that's what the people need to do, if the government no longer protects liberty, and Jefferson wrote that the reason they have a government put in place is to protect liberty, to protect the rights that pre-exist the government being there in the first place. If they're no longer doing that, if something else is going on, then the people have the right and the duty to alter or abolish it. And the pledge, basically, people are saying just the opposite, and I think that was intentional, clearly, on the part of Francis Bellamy, who wrote it, and the others that promoted it. They were trying to wipe out that very important knowledge on the part of the American people as to what their rights and duties are, and to make themselves feel that they were subservient and subjugate themselves to this unitary political power, which is contradictory to the Declaration of Independence, and frankly, contradictory even to the when you read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and go through all the ratifying processes that went on. That certainly wasn't what they were saying then either. And even to the point, I'd like to mention that during the 19th century, before 1861, there were numerous times where states had thought they might leave the Union. Not only had that been made a condition of ratification by Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York, where the states that ratified said, well, we reserve the right to rescind our agreement, to withdraw our consent. And Thomas Jefferson said, well, if they want to do that, the northern states at one time when he was coming into office, which tended to be not states that voted for him, but more for John Adams, who'd been the second president, some of them were talking about maybe they would leave the Union. It happened, and he said, well, if they want to leave, that's fine. We can be friends. There's no need for violence. He said, maybe we could have 3 or 4 confederacies on this continent. That might be better than one giant one, for instance, you see. Also during the War of 1812, there was the Hartford Convention. Some of the northern states were thinking of leaving. They didn't like the War of 1812. They decided not to do that. There was also a move by Mid-Atlantic states to secede from the Union. But everybody understood that was part of the arrangement. It was a voluntary federation. And the Pledge of Allegiance, by putting in indivisible, attempts to wipe that out in the public mind and the public psyche.
Okay. So why is the pledge so popular?
Well, I think there were a couple things, Paul. Again, we've seen it indoctrinated to many people when they're at a very young age. And so folks grow up with that sort of thing. And when you think about it, it is so ingrained now in people that the state, and by the state I mean the nation state and the U.S. federal government, has become something that people now look at almost as their religion. There's more unification around that and more veneration of that than there is of more traditional religious faith and the values of home and family. Everything is subject to that. And I think there's been just a giant indoctrination campaign on this topic, gone on for a very long time, over a century. And so that's what people have come to believe, and it's become a cherished belief. And when you bring this topic up, it's a sensitive one and a controversial one, for obvious reasons.
It certainly is. Now, every once in a while, even now, but I don't think it's they're taken too seriously. You hear of a state like maybe Texas or California, somebody saying, well, we don't like what's going on with the federal government, so we may secede. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, that's interesting, Paul. Yes, if they were to do so, they would be acting consistent with the Declaration of Independence and consistent with the ratification of the Constitution. Now, these secession movements and ideas normally bubble up to the surface in an era where there was a negative mass social mood, and we can see that now. I don't know if we'll see secession. I read an interesting analysis. Somebody said, well, we're not likely to see secession the same way we saw the 2 previous times, 1861 and 1776. It might be something different. It could be that we'll have a de facto secession where, states might reassert themselves through nullification, which is Thomas Jefferson called the rightful remedy between submitting to usurpation by the general government, which is what we call the federal government, the general government in our federal system, and leaving the Union. So in other words, and we're already seeing that, Madison said, refuse to cooperate with the officers of the Union when they do things that weren't delegated to them. We're not supposed to do it. So you might see different laws and things, sanctuary. You could, we see this now in immigration, you might see it sanctuary for gun rights, where they say, hey, the Constitution says the federal government's got nothing to say about this. And you could see it in other areas as well. So I think something like that could happen. I don't think it's going to happen immediately or anything like that. What about with all the financial burdens on the federal government? Could something happen there where you get certain states, maybe states together, not just one state by itself, but what if you had a Great Lakes Federation or Texas and some neighboring states? And then there are some really controversial issues like abortion, for instance, where there seems to be a group of states that have one view of it, another group of states that kind of tend in the other direction. Maybe they're more opposed to it for various reasons. And someone suggested that either we get back to where we say, hey, that wasn't something delegated to the federal government. The Supreme Court didn't have the right to issue an opinion that would direct everybody on that topic. That's more of a state-by-state issue. Maybe we'll get back to that, or maybe some of the states will say, you know what, we've had it, we're done with this. Or it may be a generational thing. With all these new technologies, there are some people that think we no longer need to have a territorial monopoly for government the way we think of it. You could have a lot of those services done, in a market setting, free market competition for providing the various services that we think of from government. So there are a lot of different possibilities of what could happen. I do suspect that the drive towards those sorts of ideas, though, will probably grow over time. I think it'll come back again. It is interesting. Like you say, now California talks about it, previously Texas and some of the other states. It'll be for different reasons, and hopefully it'll be peaceful.
Okay. And so when you see these various discussions about secession, sometimes it's the right and sometimes it's the left who are both trying to invoke this idea of being able to freely leave the Union.
Right. Well, that's right. It's a great point, because during the Obama years, some of the people on the left said, oh, you people, you're traitors and all that. And then now you get people from the right that might say, hey, you can't do that now that, we like the president that's in power. But that's a great point. It might be the best way to have a peaceful thing. And you have Vermont, by the way, is another state where they have the Second Vermont Republic. Vermont was part of the original, was part of New York originally, seceded from New York, and they joined, they seceded from New York, and they were an independent republic for a while, the first Vermont Republic. So you could see all these sorts of things that could happen. It doesn't mean the sky is falling. It might actually be an improvement in terms of decentralizing. It may be that we're so big now that it's impossible to have what they thought of at the time with representative government, and we only have 535 legislators there in Washington. Maybe with the population and this huge landmass, maybe Jefferson was right that we need to break it up, and we can still be friends and everybody get along. It might actually create some competition that would make it more difficult for governments to be oppressive of their people.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll have to leave it, but it's always enlightening to hear your thoughts on various topics, and I think this is a great one, and I think more people need to take a look at the Pledge of Allegiance and the Declaration of Independence and decide for themselves. So thank you, Dennis.
You're welcome, Paul, and thank you. Thank you very much.